Hi. Today I was asked to speak about theological art, but first I thought it would be nice to tell you a little bit about my background. And I grew up in Wisconsin, and I've always enjoyed art and painting, especially all kinds of art, though, really. And grew up going to Catholic school and going to church all of my life. I also love to read, and I've worked in many libraries. And I also love children, both my own and others. I have spent some of the past 10 years and more teaching children. And after I went to art college in Minneapolis, I studied graphic design and illustration. I came out to California, and I decided it would be good to get a bachelor's degree. And I saw they had a program for that at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley for theology and art. And so I studied there at the GTU. And while I was studying theology and art, I worked in this building, the GTU library, just for a job when I was a student. And I continued working in the library after I finished up my degree. And at that point, I met my husband, Michael, who was working in the building. And we have been married for 32 years. So I feel like he's the biggest blessing in my life. When I was a student at the GTU, my main advisor was Father Michael Morris. And I think a lot of you at Mary Magdalene Parish might remember him. He was very active in the parish and one of the Dominicans. I was connected with the Dominican school. I also had a few other professors that were very well known in the arts. One of them was Professor Jane Daggett Dillenberger, who is no longer alive, but she was very, very well known for her work in Christianity and art. And I had another person on my committee whose name was Joe Milgram, who was Jewish and who taught a lot of classes on Judaism and art. And the three of them, Father Michael Morris and Jane Dillenberger and Joe Milgram, were a wonderful committee and people to study under at that time. So after I finished my degree and I was working there in the library, I continued to work in the library, but I got a second job as an art curator. And these kinds of questions often came up. Theological art, what is it? And how is it used within the church? What is theological art? Well, art transforms a space, leading us to new ways of seeing and thinking. Theological art leads us closer to God. So I told you that I continued to work in this library, but I had a second job as the art curator. And we put up a new exhibit maybe every month to 2 months. So I did this job for 3 years, and I was in charge of the cases that you see in the front of this photo and the wall in the background and another wall on the floor below. But in the center there, you can see a sculpture by Stephen de Stabler. It's a winged angel, and I was instrumental in having that sculpture installed in that space. And at that point, we also had an exhibit of other sculptures that he had made. You can find his work all around Berkeley and in the Bay Area. He is no longer alive either, but I got to meet him and know him, Stephen de Stabler. And this winged angel, it's kind of a broken angel. Many of his pieces from that time were figures that were somewhat broken off. And he was married to a woman who had physical disabilities, and his works reflected her suffering. And then this is an abstract expressionist painting by an artist named Jay DeFeo. And she had some lovely little paintings. She painted her paintings very, very thick. She lived in San Francisco, and is well known for her painting called The Rose, where the paint was so thick that the whole canvas sagged down to the ground, and they had to break open a whole window just to get the painting out of her studio. And here we see Christo's running fence. I did an exhibit with photos of some of the works that Christo had done. Christo is a team, a husband and wife team, with the last name of Christo. Their work, however, and all of these other works that I'm showing on this screen, they really make you think about the space that they're in and to see things in a new and different way. I was walking in the hills recently and looked out over the landscape and thought about Christo's running fence, because it looked like the type of space that this picture was taken in. And I could almost imagine the fence being there. When we see a fence, we think about divisions of space and the people who might be on either side of that fence. And currently, we can think about that in terms of the border. It brings up images of immigrants and the struggles that they go through. How is theological art used in the church? Well, one thing you can do is use it to teach the faith. So I was working at the GTU library and also working as a curator there, working with the books and working as a curator. And my husband and I had our first 3 children while I had these jobs. After my third was born, I decided that it was time for me to stay home. And I didn't know that we would have 3 more children afterwards. I ended up staying home for 12 years. And so I was no longer employed at the Graduate Theological Union. But I was busy during that time. And I was very active at St. Jerome's Parish in El Cerrito in the Family Faith program. In fact, I was in the Family Faith program for 17 years. And for the last 5 years, I was the director of religious education there. So here is a photo of one of the first communion classes. And these children are now either juniors or seniors in high school. And I see my friend Mrs. Anu, who was the second grade teacher there back when the school was open. Well, while teaching family faith, I like to use a lot of art in my lessons. Here's one example of that. This is from a book of saints that we put together. Each child made their own book of saints. And what we did was we said, okay, I made a little form where they could fill out the name of their saint and the birthplace and date of their saint, and then just a couple of interesting facts. I tried to make it as simple as possible. These were middle school age students who were making these books. Then we Xeroxed our pages and we each shared our pages with each other so that we didn't have to all do the research. And each week we would think about one of the saints and then make an art piece where we were picturing that saint and trying to show something about them. For example, on the left, we have St. Dominic. And of course, the Dominicans have their black and white habits. And so we did a black and white piece. And in the middle, you can see the Blessed Virgin Mary. This was a tooling project done on tin. And on the right, we have St. Therese, the little flower. And that was done with watercolor and ink. Theological art is often used for seasonal decor in the church. Back when I was at St. Jerome's, we made the First Communion banners for our children when they were getting First Communion. So I've made 6 of these. Actually, I've made more of these because if a family was unable to do it for some reason, I usually made one for that child as well. But we would hang the banners as part of the Easter decor during the Easter season until the first communion occurred, and then they would hang on the edge of the pew, and that would be the pew that that family would sit in for the first communion service. And here we have Mary Magdalene at Christmas time with the angel banners hanging outside. And these angel banners to me are just kind of large, very large versions of what I did with the first communion banner. It's really fun to see that on the outside of our church. And I think that it adds something and says something to the community. I know Father Nick wanted us to really announce we are open and we are doing things at our church during this pandemic time. Another way that theological art is used in the church is as an aid to private prayer and meditation. And this was another project that I did with my students, and it was just making a rosary. Each child made their own rosary, and the hardest thing about this project was just to collect all of the beads and the crucifixes and the Mary medals that were needed to make a rosary. But the lesson was well worth it, because if a person's going to pray the rosary, they have to learn all of the prayers. They have to learn the creed, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be. But they also have to learn the mysteries of the rosary, which basically are teaching about the life of Christ with his mother Mary. And it is a great teaching tool. And we also talked about the history of it and St. Dominic and how he used the rosary as a teaching tool. And then at the end of the lesson, I had the families come and we did a living rosary where we sat in a big circle, and I actually made some very large images of each mystery, and the children themselves took turns saying the prayers. And it was something to experience. We passed a large ball around to keep track of where we were in the rosary. So, another way that we could use theological art is for evangelization. And of course, we have a long history in the church. So, again, a teaching tool, but also a history tool. At one point, I was asked to go into the public school to a 7th grade class and teach them about the Middle Ages. This was a project that I did speaking about medieval manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, and I brought in calligraphy pens so that the students could practice trying to do some calligraphy. And I know that the first thing that a person likes to do when they get one of these pens, if they've never done it before, is to try to write their name. So I decided I would print out all of the alphabet. So I had blank pieces of paper with rule lines for writing in, and then the first letter, which we call a versal. And they could pick the versal for their name. And they were asked just to write their name and where they are from, and then to add an illustration into the versal and around the edges that would say something about who they are. This is public school, but when I saw my letter M and the way that the M was shaped, I saw a manger scene in there and ended up with a Christmas image here as my sample piece. The children had all different sorts of images in theirs, but I think just talking about the illuminated manuscript in the Middle Ages, you can't help but go into quite a bit of history about Christianity. Also, in 4th grade, I taught about the missions. They do a large unit on California missions and the history of California when the students are in 4th grade. This particular one was made by my son John in 4th grade. And I wanted to tell you a story about this because when we finished painting our missions, The class went on a tour of Mission Dolores in San Francisco. We started outdoors, and there was a young man leading the tour who had quite a bit to say about the effect of the missions on Native Americans, and he had a very negative view of the way the Native Americans were treated by the missionaries. But at the end of that tour, we went inside the church and then afterwards inside the little mission space at Mission Dolores. And it was at that point that a student came up to me and said, "Oh, Ms. Mary, I understand why you love God so much." She said, "It's so beautiful." And I really thought that she understood, and it really struck me that a little girl who I don't think was ever brought to church, knowing her parents, I don't think she was ever someone who was brought to a church before, was really impacted by the beauty of the church. The other way that theological art is used is in terms of evangelization is that we can focus on nature. Nature being the ultimate creation by God. And if we are really looking carefully at nature, we are really meditating on God's work. This piece was done by a fourth grade student of mine, and it's based on the fifth day of creation when God created the fishes of the sea and the birds of the air. I had asked the students to do white on black for the underwater part and black on white for over the water. And this piece is a sample piece I did for a unit on Matisse and collage, and you can see I have a tree there in the background with a landscape. We've also done things like just focusing on the shape of a snowflake or looking very, very closely at a flower. And all of these things are appreciating God's creation and God's beauty in the world. Theological art is used as an aid to communal worship. I love this picture of St. Mary Magdalene filled with people and can hardly wait to see all of those people in our church once again. But the architecture of a church, and in the Catholic Church, all of the things that are inside and the arrangement of them have so much beauty and so much meaning. One of the things I've always loved to do as a family faith teacher was to bring my students inside of the church and just talk to them about everything in it, what everything was called, the purpose of it, why it was there, what is a baptismal font, why is it located where it is, and as you get closer and closer, what is the nave of the church? Why do we call it that? What are the windows about? What is pictured in the stained glass? And as you get farther up to the altar area, getting closer and closer to God, and finally ending up at the tabernacle and learning about God inside of the tabernacle. It's so beautifully done, and the space, the architecture, and furniture, furnishings, and everything within the church is beautiful and meaningful. Theological art can be a tool for promoting social justice. So, since the pandemic and closing down of schools, the public library where I work at elementary school and where I also teach art, the library part of my job was ended because the library didn't open this year. And I was asked to come over to the high school library. And I was asked to learn a new computer program, new to me, called Canva. And I was asked to use this to promote different types of books each month. So this month, February, being African American Lives, celebrating African Americans during February, I made this poster, Black Lives Matter. This was actually the start of a 14-page promotion of new books that we have in our library that are featuring people of color. I thought it went very well, that this was an effective tool, because this went out to the students, and I immediately had students asking for these books. Many of them have been checked out, and I'm sure the students are reading them right now. Creating new options. So this is a submission for the new banners outside of our church for Easter time. This is one half of my 2 banners, and it's Joy at Dawn. My idea was that one side of the door we would have a banner that says Tears at Dusk, and the other side Joy at Dawn, because I was thinking about how this is such a hard year for so many people and such a sad year. And it really relates to the Easter story, where we go through Jesus dying on the cross at Good Friday and the sadness of that, but also the hope and the joy on Easter morning. My daughter Rose has worked with me on this. I made a drawing, and she's good at Photoshop, and so she has been filling it in with color, and we're about halfway done here. And then you can see here one of our Stations of the Cross from the parish. These stations were originally painted by the 7th grade class at St. Mary Magdalene School under the direction of Father Nick and Father John Harmon. And the stations are very beautifully done, but to hang them outside, was something we wanted to have an outdoor set so that people could safely say the Stations of the Cross. To hang outside canvases is very difficult. They can get wet and ruined in the rain. So the idea was that the stations could be printed up on outdoor banner material and have grommets in them, and then easily be rainproof and also easy to hang and to kind of roll away and put away until next year we could use them outdoors again. My work on this has been to add the surrounding color and the, as you can see, sort of a gray crisscross of lines as a bit of a frame around the work, and the little banner with the numbers on it down below. And that's something that's hanging outside right now in the parking lot of our parish. If you come over to the parking lot down below the church, you can see them hanging there. I also hung on the fence the wording, the reflections that go with each station, so that if you wanted to come and meditate on those by yourself at some point during Lent, you could come and follow along and read the meditations and look at the pictures. This is something new for us that we've had to do because of the year of COVID. St. John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, said that artists bring an epiphany of God to other people. So I said, let's do that. Let's bring an epiphany of God to others and make art. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed my presentation and that you will consider making some religious art, and that will bring you closer to God.